All right, moving on. Today is about those finer details, but before we get into that, I thought I would just do a bit of catch up where I've got to on my particular piece. I'll do a little bit of demo on it, and then I just have a bit of a demo piece that we can do some other stuff on. So I'm not quite ready for the detailing on this, but I know that some of you are far enough along that you could benefit from seeing the video, so we'll go ahead. So I've got most of the secondary and some of the tertiary forms resolved on this. Have the ears on. I did change the design significantly on the ears. The original design, they were quite tall and pinned back, so I really decided to pull them out from the head and make them smaller and much rounder. And the other thing you can see I've done is added just some pure design elements, these black spheres, and turning this large cranium into a bit of a crown or something that has some decorative elements, so but still being fleshy. Trying to get some harder edge geometry in it, so not everything is organic. And so because these ears stick out so far, I do need to do a little bit of modeling and texturing on the back. And I'll probably also do things like this muscle here, which would in human anatomy would be the that sternocleidomastoid that we often talk about, really important for turning the neck, and it sticks out quite a bit when the neck is under tension. I might pull that up here to integrate this into here, because we've got this blank spot. Overall, I'm happy with the integration between the cranium and the face and the bit of the chest and torso. So I've got a little bit more work to do, but I'm far enough along on some places that I can demo the things like wrinkles and ridges, and we'll talk about veins, and then warts or pimples and things like that, and some different texturing. Okay, so that's where we'll head. Some things to keep in mind when you're starting on this stage of the sculpture. First of all, reference, always have reference. So I've got a couple older people with obvious wrinkles. Even on a fairly young person, it's good to have these kinds of references, because you can see where the lines typically start. So lots of lines around the eyes and following, the shape of the cheeks and in the forehead, in the neck, and again, depending on the age of the model. So have reference. Your light is really important. I'll do my best to not wash out the video, but also have the light so I can actually see. And being really, really careful, because this is the stage where you've got things like ears hanging out, and it's easy, and I do it myself all the time, no matter how careful I think I'm being, is you're so focused on putting in this awesome little wrinkle that you don't realize that you've got a death grip on the ear and you've flattened it right out. So as much as you can, support your hand on your other hand, or on the table. Okay, so let's start with ridges. So working and everything on here is just been built the same way that we did when we started, starting with little pieces of clay, adding them on and blending them in. That goes for some of this more decorative stuff up top. But if you want to cut in a ridge, then use a loop, and I tend to use the same loop, even though it seems a little bit too large sometimes, over and over, rather than a smaller loop. But I can just cut that in, and then concept artist Don Lanning always likes to call this trenching, where you take your line and you, rather than just having it, you know, just with those obvious cut marks, you're going to turn it into a bit of a trench. So if you have somewhere that you need, you know, a little bit more light and shadow, or you want to dig in, carve it in and then again blend it so the forms flow naturally from one to another. You don't want it to look like it's a big cut. So that's what I would call creating a ridge, where we're actually cutting in a line or gouging out and then kind of blending that in. So kind of working a little bit of the opposite way. Rather than adding a piece and blending it, we're cutting a chunk out and then blending that. Wrinkles aren't really any different, other than they're just a little bit smaller. So if we think of some of those lines on that come off the eyes, I'm using a little guitar string loop. Another thing about wrinkles is it's important to make sure you don't get the lines too straight. And then obviously out of the corner of the eye. If they're too swoopy, they won't look convincing. So a little bit of a tremor in your line can help. Depending on how deep you are, you can trench them out. Actually, sometimes just turn the loop tool sideways. And what you'll notice with the polymer is you get all these little clay bits that are super irritating. And if you try to just rake them, lots of your lines disappear. So this is where we would use the 99% alcohol. If you don't have it, just be careful and do what you can. I'm just going to put a couple more of these in. Again, thinking about the kind of weight of the flesh under the eye, and then the way these cheek muscles start to sag. And then I'll put the odd kind of cross line in there. Again, Don Lanning likes to call that the power of the X, if you've ever taken any of his classes online or seen any of his demos. Okay, so isopropyl alcohol, 99%, don't use the 70%. I'm just going to put a tiny bit in the bottom of the cup. It's dangerous just to leave the bottle open on your desk, especially if you're clumsy like me. And I like to use a fairly soft brush and see different approaches to this. I use a very small amount, and when you brush it, it just acts as a bit of a solvent and just softens up those lines and also gets rid of some of those little bits. Okay. Again, I prefer to not just soak it down, although I have seen some artists use quite a bit. And then while the clay is still a little bit wet with the alcohol, it's a little bit softer, and sometimes you can do some different things. And it's important with these fine details, you don't try to build them up all at once. Okay, so we can cut things in and use a bit of alcohol on a brush, kind of soften them up a little bit. it just keeps the lines from looking cut in. So if you want to get rid of some of your really fine tool marks, you can use alcohol. And like I always do, I could fart around with these forever. Okay, putting in some X's. It's not so important the lines that you make, it's the directions that they go. So if you've done a good job of, you know, following the geometry and the anatomy, then these lines will just naturally flow from what you've already done. You may notice that your clay turns a slightly different color. It can look a little bit pasty after it's had alcohol in it. That's not an issue. The more alcohol on the surface just tends to kind of dry out a little bit. So that's some wrinkles. Again, I'm going to really, you know, make this character old, so I'll be spending lots of time building those wrinkles in the main areas. I will probably do some fine lines in the lips. So I'm just cutting them in with a needle tool, trying not to be too regular. If it looks too regular, like you're using the same weight and the same type of gouge every time, it's just not as convincing. A little bit more alcohol. Okay, starting to bring some life to it. I'm sure it's easy to see already how you can spend hours and hours adding wrinkles and lines, and allow yourself to do that if that's where you want to go. And even if you have a fairly young character without saggy skin, some carefully placed wrinkles and ridges just add a level of believability to your piece. Another thing to keep in mind is you might have to go over sections again and again if you're using a combination of techniques, because we're going to get into some, using some texture stamps, and so you might want to carve some lines in, do some stamping, even if it's just with the point of a tool or a toothpick, and then you might want to carve those lines in again and layer things up. The more you can layer your approaches, the more interesting and the more convincing they will be. So I'm going to switch to this demo piece that I've made now, just so I can do a bunch of techniques on top of each other that maybe wouldn't work all together, but for the sake of the demo, we can put them on the same piece. So if you want to put in some veins that would be under the skin, it's no different than the approach we were using with some of the forms. You just want to change the direction a little bit and let it meander. And so if we imagine that the vein kind of split off there, you don't want it going the same direction for too far. really start with small pieces. Giant bulging veins look okay if you're making a bodybuilder, but you do have to be careful because they can look a little bit overdone. I decided I hate that. Okay, so right now it's kind of cool looking, but it does stick up a little bit too much. So the first thing I like to do is just flatten it out with my fingers to get the profile fairly low. And then our same approach, we're going to just lightly blend in the edges, because remember, these are under the flesh, these are not sitting on top of the flesh. I'm leaving the very ends so they don't get totally obliterated, but and then maybe I'll really kind of flatten this one out, just gently raking it with the tool. Just because that vein wouldn't be a consistent depth under the skin. And then we'll do the blending with the alcohol. So brush it along and then across. And then while it's a little bit soft. You can add it in. So it's better to be subtle than, you know, having a giant sausage vein, unless your character, if it's a little bit of a Mars Attacks alien or something, then maybe that actually makes sense. But subtle is usually pretty good. So in addition to veins, we can just make other blemishes just by using tiny little balls of clay, putting a couple reddish ones on there. Try to keep the pattern regular. I mean, you can just have one on its own, but if you want a kind of area of spotty skin, and you can see how even the tiniest little chunk of clay, as you start to flatten it out, gets larger. So think about that. So there's just this irregular kind of series of spots. So you can blend them with the tool, but because they're sitting pretty flat, we can probably just get away with washing them down with some alcohol. So you've got a little bit of color variation, but more importantly, you've got that change in surface. So there's a couple, you know, ones that were made with a tool that with a concave end on it. They're almost too regular for a blemish. Okay, a couple more things we'll look at is just adding some texture. And as I mentioned earlier, this is something you'll want to do in stages. You'll want to cut in some lines and then add in some texture. So we'll just start with this relatively open area. Sculpey brand does make a version of clay that you can make. You can make texture stamps from. You can make little molds from. I also have some silicone here. Something that works really well is like I believe this is avocado skin and like a large orange that has a fairly rough surface. And what you can do is just use it as a texture stamp. So this is a pretty big piece. It's made for much larger pieces. So here's where you have to be careful you don't destroy 20 hours worth of work by squishing it with a texture stamp. But if we were to have some lines carved in, some fairly aggressive lines, and then stamp over top of them. And then wash that down like we do. Just gives a pretty interesting texture. A little bit too much on my brush there. I never like it to run. It's not going to hurt anything if it does. And then if I wanted to put that back in, I'd put that line in a little harder. Maybe add a little mole or something on top. Smack the camera a couple times. Okay. If you don't have stamps, you can just use the end of a tool, and just by making some fairly random patterns, you can start to create a pretty interesting texture. And again, you can go right over the wrinkles and then cut the wrinkles back in, add a little bit more texture. What I like about this approach is it gives me lots of control, and I can put in some deeper marks and some smaller marks. And again, a toothpick will work. Can cut in some wrinkles. Brush just to knock it back a bit, so it's not so obvious that we've punched things in. Toothbrush. Again, it will pull some of your detail. Got a chip brush here with the bristles cut short. Just gonna stab away at it. just whatever you can do to give it give the flesh a bit of variation. Our skin is filled with pores and with pockmarks and all sorts of irregularities, and your sculpture will be more interesting if there's some texture to the skin. It doesn't have to be extreme. Again, I tend to go overboard on the texture. That's just simply my preference. The key is to keep layering it up and try to keep things fairly random, and just be very careful that you don't completely squish something that you've already worked on. A bit of alcohol if you have it. Okay, so something to just break up that regular surface and to make it feel more like it's skin that has some history and has some miles on it. Obviously, I've made a fairly significant shift in the design, particularly in the cranium. I was pursuing those geometric shapes and the decorative elements on the cranium primarily to do a bit of a demo within a demo on doing harder edge shapes and more geometry, something along the lines of H.R. Geiger, some of the early Alien designs. However, Mr. Happy here took a tumble onto the floor and a lot of that was damaged, so I started over on the cranium design and just simplified it closer to the original drawing. So I will probably do a separate video at some point on some of those more harder edge geometry designs with Polymer. But I think you can see with the techniques we discussed last time, able to get a lot of texture into the form, a lot of wrinkles, a few blemishes. So I think I'm going to call that done in terms of the overall sculpt. So one more video to come, a little bit of painting. I will also show you how to add some mixed media, so if you want to add cloth or metal components to the sculpt before curing it, we'll do that in the next video as well.